In the bustling courthouse of downtown Atlanta, the morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. 23-year-old Alexandra Bennett strutted into courtroom 7B like she owned it, her designer heels clicking against the marble tiles. Her father's wealth had always been her shield, and today was no different, or so she thought. The charge was simple: reckless driving and endangering pedestrians while racing her brand-new Ferrari through a school zone. But Alexandra wasn't concerned. Her father's expensive legal team had gotten her out of trouble countless times before. She sat in the defendant's chair, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging the proceedings around her. When Judge Robert Washington entered the courtroom, everyone rose, everyone except Alexandra. She continued typing away on her phone, a smirk playing at the corners of her perfectly glossed lips. The bailiff had to clear his throat twice before she finally looked up, rolling her eyes dramatically as she stood. "Miss Bennett," Judge Washington began, his voice carrying decades of experience and dignity, "you're here today facing charges of—" "Listen," Alexandra interrupted, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Can we speed this up? I have a lunch reservation at Le Cirque, and Daddy's lawyer will handle everything anyway." Her voice dripped with condescension as she glanced at the judge's bench with barely concealed disdain. The courtroom fell silent. Even Alexandra's high-priced attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Washington, known throughout the state for his fairness and patience, removed his glasses slowly, fixing Alexandra with a steady gaze. "Young lady," he began, his tone measured but firm, "in my 30 years on this bench, I've seen all manner of defendants. But rarely have I encountered such blatant disrespect for these proceedings." Alexandra's smirk widened. "Well, maybe if you'd spent less time on that bench and more time making something of yourself, you wouldn't be stuck here dealing with minor traffic violations." She emphasized the word minor with air quotes, earning gasps from the gallery. Judge Washington remained perfectly composed, though something shifted in his eyes. He glanced down at the case file before him, then back at Alexandra. The next few moments would become legendary in the courthouse's history. "Miss Bennett," he began, his voice carrying a weight that made even Alexandra's attorney sit up straighter, "your record shows this isn't your first offense. In fact, this is your 7th traffic violation this year alone. But more concerning than your dangerous driving is your apparent belief that the law doesn't apply to you." Alexandra's smirk began to fade as Judge Washington continued, "You seem to think that wealth equals worth, that money can buy immunity from responsibility. Today, we're going to correct that misconception." The judge paused, letting his words hang in the air. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ancient ceiling fan creaking overhead. Alexandra's perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edge of the defendant's table, her knuckles turning white. For the first time since entering the courthouse, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Little did she know, Judge Washington's next words would not only change her life but would also become a viral sensation, teaching a lesson about respect, privilege, and justice that would resonate far beyond the walls of courtroom 7B. The events that would unfold over the next few hours would prove that sometimes, the most powerful verdicts aren't just about punishment, they're about transformation. Judge Washington leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the bench. The seasoned judge had seen thousands of cases throughout his career, but something about Alexandra's attitude struck a deeper chord. Perhaps it was because earlier that morning, he'd visited his grandson's elementary school, the very same school zone where Alexandra had been racing her Ferrari. "Before I deliver my verdict," Judge Washington began, his voice resonating through the hushed courtroom, "I'd like to show you something, Miss Bennett." He nodded to the court clerk, who wheeled in a large display screen. Alexandra's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched with mild interest, though she continued to maintain her air of indifference. The screen flickered to life, showing security camera footage from the day of her reckless driving incident. The footage was crystal clear, Alexandra's red Ferrari weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds, forcing a school bus to swerve sharply. Children were visible on the sidewalk, some jumping back in fear as the sports car roared past. One little girl dropped her backpack, startled by the sudden noise and wind. "That little girl," Judge Washington said quietly, "is my granddaughter, Lily. She's 7 years old and loves to draw butterflies." His words carried no anger, just a profound weight that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Alexandra's smirk finally faltered. For the first time, she actually looked at the footage, really seeing the consequences of her actions. The children's frightened faces. The bus driver's desperate maneuver. The chaos she'd left in her wake. "But this isn't just about my granddaughter," the judge continued. "It's about every child who walks those streets, every parent who trusts that their kids will be safe on their way to school, every member of our community who deserves to feel secure in their own neighborhood." He pressed a button, and the footage changed to show different angles of Alexandra's previous infractions: running red lights, cutting off elderly pedestrians, nearly sideswiping a cyclist. Each incident played out like a damning testimony to her complete disregard for others' safety. Alexandra's attorney tried to interject. "Your Honor, we've already agreed to pay all the fines. Money," Judge Washington interrupted, his voice firm but measured, "is precisely the problem here." He turned his attention back to Alexandra. "Tell me, Miss Bennett, how much did that Ferrari cost?" Alexandra straightened in her chair, a hint of pride returning to her voice. $300,000. It was a birthday gift from Daddy." "I see," the judge nodded thoughtfully. "And how did you earn that car?" The question seemed to confuse her. "Earn it? I just told you, it was a gift." "Yes, exactly." Judge Washington stood up, his tall frame commanding attention. "You've never had to earn anything in your life, have you? Everything has been handed to you: your car, your lifestyle, your sense of immunity from consequences. But today, that changes." The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Even the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Alexandra's attorney was frantically scribbling notes, while her father, who had been watching from the back row, pulled out his phone, presumably to call in more legal reinforcements. "Miss Bennett," Judge Washington continued, "your actions show a pattern of behavior that can no longer be solved by simply writing a check. Money hasn't taught you responsibility; if anything, it has shielded you from it. So today, we're going to try a different approach." Alexandra's confidence was visibly crumbling. She glanced back at her father, who was now engaged in a heated whisper with another lawyer who had just entered the courtroom. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, money wouldn't be able to fix this situation. Judge Washington picked up his gavel, but before delivering his verdict, he had one final question. "Miss Bennett, do you know what the average person in this city earns in a year?" She shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I don't know, $50,000. Try $35,000, he corrected. "Less than 1/8 the cost of your birthday present." And yet, these people manage to follow traffic laws, show respect for their community, and teach their children the value of responsibility. The judge's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Alexandra's designer outfit and perfectly styled hair suddenly seemed out of place in the stark reality of the courtroom. Her world of privilege was about to collide head-on with accountability, and Judge Washington's next words would ensure that this lesson would stay with her, and everyone watching, for a very long time. Judge Washington adjusted his robes and reached for a thick folder on his bench. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across Alexandra's increasingly anxious face. The confidence that had carried her into the courtroom had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. "During my review of your case, Miss Bennett," Judge Washington began, "I took the liberty of looking into your community service history." He opened the folder, though it was clear he already knew its contents by heart. "Would you care to guess what I found?" Alexandra shifted uncomfortably in her chair. For once, she remained silent. "Nothing," the judge continued. Not a single hour of service to your community. No volunteer work. No charitable contributions that weren't made in your father's name for tax purposes. Nothing that suggests any understanding of civic responsibility. Her father stood up from his seat in the gallery. Your Honor, my daughter's charitable contributions are not on trial here, Mr. Bennett, Judge Washington interrupted firmly, please take your seat. Your daughter is an adult, and she will be treated as one in my courtroom. The wealthy businessman slowly sat down, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His daughter had never seen him silenced like this before, and the sight sent a chill down her spine. Now, Judge Washington continued, pulling out another document, I have here a letter from Mrs. Rodriguez, the bus driver who had to swerve to avoid your Ferrari that day. He began to read, I've been driving that route for 15 years. Those children are like my own. When I saw that red car racing toward us, my heart stopped. In my rearview mirror, I could see the kids on the sidewalk jumping back in terror. We were lucky that day, but luck shouldn't be what keeps our children safe. Alexandra's eyes were fixed on her hands, now folded in her lap. The designer rings on her fingers suddenly seemed gaudy and out of place. And here's another letter, the judge continued, from Mr. Chen, the crossing guard who witnessed the incident. He adjusted his glasses. I watched these kids grow up year after year. I know their names, their dreams, their laughter. When that car came speeding through, I saw more than just a traffic violation. I saw someone who thought their time was more valuable than our children's lives. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the usual creaking of the old building seemed to have paused in anticipation. Alexandra's attorney placed a sympathetic hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, her eyes still downcast. The thing about privilege, Miss Bennett, Judge Washington said, his voice softer now but no less powerful, is that it can be a gift or a curse. It can open doors to help others, or it can blind us to our own humanity. Today, you have an opportunity to learn which path you'll choose. He picked up another document, this one bearing the official court seal. I've given this case considerable thought, and I've decided on a sentence that I believe will serve both justice and education. Alexandra finally looked up, her mascara slightly smudged from wiping her eyes. The judge's next words would reshape her understanding of consequences and privilege in ways her expensive education never had. First, Judge Washington declared, your driver's license will be suspended for 1 year. He raised his hand to silence the immediate protest from Alexandra's legal team. But that's just the beginning. During this year, you will complete 1,000 hours of community service. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Alexandra's father jumped to his feet again, but Judge Washington continued undeterred. These hours will be split between 3 assignments. First, you will work as a crossing guard assistant at the very school zone where you endangered those children. You'll learn their names, their faces, and understand what Mr. Chen protects every day. Alexandra's mouth opened in shock, but the judge wasn't finished. Second, you will spend time working with Mrs. Rodriguez, helping to clean and maintain school buses after hours. You'll learn what it means to be responsible for others' safety. The young woman's perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles white with tension. But Judge Washington had saved the most impactful part of his sentence for last, and his next words would send shockwaves through the entire courthouse. Judge Washington paused, letting the first 2 parts of his sentence sink in. The morning light had shifted, and a beam now illuminated Alexandra's face, highlighting the tears she was trying desperately to hold back. And finally, the judge continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom, you will spend the next 6 months working at the downtown community transit center. You'll assist elderly passengers, help disabled riders and navigate the bus system, and learn what transportation means to those who can't afford $300,000 sports cars. Alexandra's father erupted from his seat. This is outrageous. You can't possibly expect, I can and I do, Mr. Bennett, Judge Washington interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. And to ensure compliance, I'm adding one more stipulation. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Alexandra. During this period, you will rely solely on public transportation. No private cars, no rideshare services, no chauffeurs. You will experience life as the majority of our citizens do. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Alexandra's legal team huddled together, frantically flipping through law books and whispering among themselves. But Judge Washington wasn't finished. Furthermore, your phone's GPS will be monitored to ensure compliance. Any violation of these terms will result in immediate jail time. He adjusted his glasses and continued, you'll also attend weekly counseling sessions with Dr. Patricia Chen, who specializes in helping young adults develop empathy and social responsibility. Alexandra sat frozen, her designer outfit suddenly feeling like a costume she'd outgrown. Her father's influence, her wealth, her privileged bubble, none of it could shield her from the reality of her actions anymore. Your Honor, Alexandra's voice cracked as she spoke for the first time since her earlier outburst, I can't possibly. My job. Ah yes, your job, Judge Washington nodded, consulting another paper. As a social media influencer promoting luxury lifestyle products. Well, Miss Bennett, consider this an opportunity to influence something truly meaningful, positive change in our community. The judge's words seemed to echo off the courthouse walls. In the gallery, several onlookers nodded in approval, while others watched in stunned silence. A young intern in the back row was furiously taking notes on her phone. This verdict would soon make headlines across the country. I've also arranged for monthly progress reports, Judge Washington continued. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Chen, and the Transit Center supervisor will provide detailed assessments of your performance and attitude. These reports will determine whether any modifications to your sentence are warranted, either more lenient or more stringent. Alexandra's perfectly curated world was crumbling around her. Her father's power, her wealth, her social status, none of it held any sway in this moment. The realization hit her like a physical force, causing her to slump in her chair. Miss Bennett, Judge Washington's voice softened slightly, I want you to understand something. This sentence isn't about punishment, it's about education. About understanding the community you live in but have never truly been part of. About learning that true worth isn't measured by the car you drive or the clothes you wear, but by how you treat others, especially those who can't do anything for you in return. He picked up his gavel, but before delivering the final strike, he added one last thing. And who knows? You might find that the connections you make during this year, the lives you touch, the perspectives you gain, they might be worth more than any luxury car or designer handbag. The gavel came down with a resounding crack. Court is adjourned. Your community service begins tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. sharp at Washington Heights Elementary. Don't be late, Miss Bennett, the school crossing guard shift starts at 7:15. As the courtroom began to clear, Alexandra remained seated, tears finally flowing freely down her cheeks. Her father was already on the phone with his legal team, demanding appeals and injunctions, but something in his daughter's expression suggested that maybe, just maybe, Judge Washington's words had cracked open a door in her heart that no amount of money could close again. The next morning dawned cold and gray. Alexandra stood at the bus stop outside her luxury apartment complex, shivering in clothes that were far more fashionable than practical. She'd never had to check bus schedules before, and the realization that she'd have to leave an hour earlier than usual just to get to the school on time was a harsh awakening. An elderly woman with a cane approached the bus stop, giving Alexandra a curious look. The young woman was clearly out of place in her expensive outfit and impractical shoes, clutching a designer bag like a shield. The older woman smiled kindly. First time taking the bus, dear? Alexandra nodded stiffly, trying to maintain her usual air of superiority. But as she watched the woman slowly lower herself onto the bench, something stirred inside her, an unfamiliar urge to help. Before she could act on it, the bus arrived, its brakes squealing to a halt. The steps up to the bus seemed impossibly tall for the elderly woman. Without thinking, Alexandra reached out to steady her. The woman's grateful smile sent an unexpected warmth through Alexandra's chest. "It gets easier," the woman said as they found seats. "I'm Rose. I've been taking this route for 20 years. Alexandra introduced herself quietly, surprised by the gentle conversation that followed. Rose talked about her grandchildren, her life in the city, and how the bus drivers had become like family over the years. It was the longest conversation Alexandra had ever had with someone outside her social circle. When they reached Washington Heights Elementary, Alexandra's stomach was in knots. Mr. Chen, the crossing guard she'd nearly hit with her Ferrari, was already there, setting up his equipment. She expected anger or resentment, but his face showed only calm determination. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," he said, handing her a fluorescent yellow vest. "Ready to learn something new today?" The vest smelled like plastic and felt rough against her silk blouse. Alexandra wrinkled her nose but put it on, remembering Judge Washington's words about jail time for noncompliance. Mr. Chen began explaining the morning routine, the traffic patterns, the signal timings, the importance of making eye contact with drivers. "Most importantly," he said, pointing to the gathering crowd of children and parents, "learn their names. Every single one of them matters." The morning rush began, and Alexandra found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility. Children darted everywhere, parents rushed with coffee cups and briefcases, cars honked impatiently. How did Mr. Chen manage this chaos every day? A small voice broke through her panic. "Excuse me, miss?" Alexandra looked down to see a little girl clutching a butterfly-covered backpack, the same girl from the security footage, Judge Washington's granddaughter, Lily. The child's innocent face brought back the image of her jumping away from the Ferrari, and Alexandra felt shame wash over her. "Can you help me cross? Grandpa said you're here to keep us safe now." The simple trust in the child's voice hit Alexandra like a physical blow. This was what she'd endangered with her reckless behavior, not just nameless pedestrians, but real people, children with dreams and families who loved them. As she helped Lily across the street, other children began to approach her too. One boy proudly showed her his new shoes. A pair of twins told her about their upcoming birthday party. A shy girl offered her a slightly crushed flower she'd picked on the way to school. Mr. Chen watched with quiet approval as Alexandra gradually relaxed into her role. By the end of the morning shift, her perfect hair was windblown, her expensive shoes were scuffed, and her designer clothes were wrinkled, but something in her face had softened. As the last stragglers hurried into the school building, Mr. Chen handed her a cup of coffee from his thermos. "You did good today, Miss Bennett. Different view from behind the crossing sign than from behind the wheel, isn't it?" Alexandra nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She watched the empty street, thinking about how she used to race through this very intersection without a second thought. Now, she could name at least a dozen children who crossed here every morning, each with their own stories, their own precious lives. "You know," Mr. Chen said thoughtfully, "I've been doing this job for 15 years. People ask me why I don't find something better paying, something more prestigious. But then I think about Lily with her butterflies, and Tommy who just lost his first tooth, and Sophia who practices her English with me every morning." He smiled. "Some things are worth more than money, Miss Bennett. Some lessons can't be bought." As Alexandra waited for the bus that would take her to her next assignment at the school bus depot, she found herself thinking about Rose from the morning ride, about Lily's trusting face, about Mr. Chen's quiet dignity. Her phone buzzed with messages from her usual social circle, brunches, shopping trips, spa days, but for the first time in her life, those things felt hollow and unimportant. The afternoon sun beat down on the school bus depot as Alexandra made her way through the gates. Her designer clothes were already showing signs of wear from the morning's crossing guard duty, and her feet ached in her expensive shoes. Mrs. Rodriguez, the bus driver she'd nearly forced off the road, stood waiting by a line of yellow buses. "Welcome to your afternoon shift," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice neutral but her eyes watchful. She handed Alexandra a pair of work gloves and cleaning supplies. "Today, you'll learn what it takes to keep these buses safe and clean for our children." Alexandra stared at the rubber gloves as if they were alien objects. She'd never cleaned anything in her life, that's what the household staff was for. But something about her morning experience with the schoolchildren had shifted something inside her, and she pulled them on without complaint. "First bus," Mrs. Rodriguez announced, opening the door to reveal what looked like the aftermath of a small tornado. Snack wrappers, forgotten homework sheets, and various small items were scattered throughout. This is what 30 excited kids leave behind every day. Each bus needs to be spotless before tomorrow morning. As Alexandra climbed aboard, she noticed small details she'd never considered before: the carefully posted rules for safety, the emergency exit instructions, the first aid kit. Mrs. Rodriguez followed her, pointing out various features. "See these handrails? They need to be sturdy and clean because little hands rely on them every day. That emergency exit? It could save lives in a crisis. Everything we do here matters, Miss Bennett, because precious cargo rides these buses." Working her way through the bus, Alexandra found herself thinking about the children she'd met that morning. Which ones rode this bus? Did Lily sit in this seat? Did the twins leave these matching hair ribbons behind? As she cleaned, Mrs. Rodriguez shared stories about her years of driving. The Christmas when parents decorated her bus as a surprise. The time she helped a lost kindergartner find his way home. The group of students who still sent her cards years after graduating. "You know," Mrs. Rodriguez said, watching Alexandra struggle with a particularly sticky piece of gum under a seat, "the day you nearly hit us, I wasn't thinking about my own safety. All I could think about were the 28 children behind me, whose parents trusted me to get them home safely." Alexandra froze, the memory of her Ferrari racing past the bus flashing through her mind. I never thought about that," she admitted quietly. "About the lives I was putting at risk." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Most people don't think about the responsibility we carry. These aren't just passengers, they're someone's whole world. Every child on this bus is somebody's greatest treasure." As the afternoon wore on, Alexandra's perfectly manicured nails chipped, and her designer clothes became stained with cleaning products. But with each bus she cleaned, she found herself caring less about her appearance and more about doing the job right. During their break, Mrs. Rodriguez shared her lunch, a homemade sandwich and fresh fruit. Alexandra, who usually lunched at exclusive restaurants, found herself touched by the simple gesture of sharing. "My mother always packs extra," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, seeing Alexandra's surprise. "She says sharing food is sharing love. Speaking of which." She pulled out her phone and showed Alexandra a photo of her family. "That's my daughter, she's starting college next year. First in our family. Every extra shift I drive helps pay for her books." Alexandra thought about her own college years, paid for without a second thought by her father. She'd never considered how other families sacrificed for education. As they cleaned the final bus of the day, they found a small backpack left behind. Inside was a worn notebook filled with careful handwriting, a child's science project about butterflies. Alexandra recognized it as Lily's work from the butterfly stickers decorating the cover. "This is Judge Washington's granddaughters," she said softly, running her fingers over the carefully drawn diagrams. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "See? Everything connects. The crossing guard who keeps them safe, the bus that carries them home, the homework they forget, it's all part of their journey. And now you're part of it too. As the sun began to set, Alexandra looked at her reflection in the bus window. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was a mess, and her clothes were ruined. But something in her eyes had changed. There was a softness there that hadn't existed before, a hint of understanding that no amount of money could buy. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Rodriguez said as they locked up the depot, "we'll do the morning route together. You'll see what it's like from the driver's seat, not racing past us, but being responsible for these precious lives." On the bus ride home, Alexandra found herself noticing things she'd never seen before: the elderly man carefully counting his change, the tired mother soothing a cranky toddler, the teenager helping a blind passenger find a seat. The city she'd sped through in her Ferrari was revealing itself to be a complex web of human connections, and she was finally beginning to see it clearly. The next morning arrived earlier than ever for Alexandra. She boarded the first bus at 5:30 a.m., her body aching from the previous day's work. The city was still dark, streetlights casting long shadows as early morning workers made their way to their jobs. She recognized Rose from yesterday, who offered her a warm smile and a seat beside her. At the bus depot, Mrs. Rodriguez was already performing pre-trip inspections on her bus. "Morning, Miss Bennett. Ready to learn what it means to be responsible for 30 young lives?" Alexandra watched intently as Mrs. Rodriguez demonstrated the thorough safety checks, testing lights, checking mirrors, inspecting every inch of the massive vehicle. "We do this every single morning," Mrs. Rodriguez explained. "No shortcuts, no rushing. One missed detail could put our children at risk." The words hit home. Alexandra thought about how she used to race through these same streets without a second thought. Now, watching Mrs. Rodriguez methodically ensure every safety feature was working properly, she understood the weight of real responsibility. "Today, you'll sit up front and observe," Mrs. Rodriguez said, patting the seat beside her. "Watch how we navigate, how we communicate with other drivers, how we keep our precious cargo safe." As they began their route, the sun slowly painted the sky in shades of pink and orange. Their first stop revealed a scene Alexandra had never considered: parents hugging their children goodbye, adjusting backpacks, offering last-minute reminders about homework and lunch. "Good morning, Mrs. R," a cheerful voice called out. It was one of the twins from the crossing guard shift. "Who's your new friend?" "This is Miss Bennett," Mrs. Rodriguez answered warmly. "She's learning about our bus family." Throughout the morning, Alexandra watched in amazement as Mrs. Rodriguez handled her job with grace and skill. She knew every child's name, asked about their families, remembered their stories. She waited patiently when a student with crutches needed extra time to board, helped a kindergartner find his lost permission slip, and gently reminded a sleepy teenager to remove his headphones for safety. "Being a bus driver isn't just about driving," Mrs. Rodriguez explained between stops. "We're the first school staff member these kids see in the morning and the last one they see in the afternoon. Sometimes, we're the only adult who asks them how their day went." At one stop, they picked up a quiet girl who looked like she'd been crying. Mrs. Rodriguez greeted her with special warmth, and the girl managed a small smile. "That's Nina," she whispered to Alexandra. "Her mother's been sick." Sometimes the small kindnesses we show make all the difference. As they navigated through morning traffic, Alexandra noticed how other drivers often cut them off or became impatient behind the bus. She felt a flush of shame, remembering her own behavior. Mrs. Rodriguez handled each situation with calm professionalism, never letting frustration show in front of the children. "Each stop, each turn, each decision we make affects these kids," Mrs. Rodriguez said as they approached the school. "It's not just about getting them from point A to point B, it's about making them feel safe, valued, and cared for along the way." As the children filed off the bus for school, many of them said goodbye to both Mrs. Rodriguez and Alexandra. Nina, the girl who had been upset earlier, paused briefly. "Thank you for waiting when I was slow this morning," she said softly. Mom says patience is a gift we give others. Alexandra felt tears prick at her eyes. All her life, she'd been rushing through traffic, rushing through relationships, rushing through experiences without ever really being present in them. Here on this bus, she was learning the value of slowing down, of seeing people as individuals with their own stories and struggles. After the last student departed, Mrs. Rodriguez turned to Alexandra with a knowing look. "You're starting to see it, aren't you? The ripple effect of our actions? When you raced past us that day, you weren't just endangering a yellow bus, you were threatening an entire community of trust and care that we build every single day." Alexandra nodded, unable to speak. She thought about how different her life could have been if she'd understood these lessons earlier. The luxury car she'd been so proud of seemed meaningless compared to the responsibility of safely transporting children to school, of being part of their daily lives in a meaningful way. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Rodriguez said as they parked the bus, "you'll help with the afternoon route. The energy is different then, they're tired, excited, sometimes upset about their day. That's when they need our patience and understanding the most." Walking to her next assignment at the downtown community transit center, Alexandra found herself paying attention to the city in a way she never had before. Each person she passed had a story, a destination, a reason for being exactly where they were. The community she'd once seen as merely backdrop to her privileged life was revealing itself to be an intricate tapestry of human connections, and she was finally beginning to understand her place within it. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in Judge Washington's courtroom. The downtown community transit center bustled with morning activity as Alexandra helped an elderly man with his walker onto a bus. Her designer clothes had long since been replaced by practical, comfortable attire, and her once perfectly manicured nails were now clean but simple. "Thank you, dear," the elderly man said, patting her hand. "You always make this old man's day a little brighter." Alexandra smiled warmly, remembering how she'd once thought such work beneath her. Now, these small moments of human connection had become the highlights of her days. Later that afternoon, she sat in Judge Washington's chambers for her final progress review. The office looked different now, less intimidating, more human. Photos of his family, including Lily, adorned the walls, and sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the room. "Well, Miss Bennett," Judge Washington began, reviewing the stack of reports before him, "I've received feedback from everyone involved in your community service. Would you like to hear what they say?" Alexandra sat straighter in her chair, her heart pounding. These past months had changed her in ways she never thought possible, but would others see that change? "Mr. Chen writes that you've become one of his most reliable crossing guards. He particularly mentions how you created a morning safety song that the children now sing while crossing." Judge Washington's eyes twinkled. "Apparently, it's quite catchy." Alexandra blushed, remembering how the simple rhyme about looking both ways had spread through the school like wildfire. "Mrs. Rodriguez reports that you've not only mastered bus cleaning protocols but have also initiated a reading program for younger students during their rides." He looked up. "She says the children now call you Miss B and ask about you when you're not there." Tears pricked at Alexandra's eyes as she thought about those morning bus rides, the stories shared, the lives touched. "And the transit center supervisor's report is particularly interesting." Judge Washington adjusted his glasses. "He mentions that you've used your social media influence to start a campaign raising awareness about public transportation accessibility. The hashtag Ride Together has apparently gone viral." Alexandra nodded. "I realized I could use my platform for something meaningful. People who followed me for luxury car posts are now learning about real transportation issues in our community." Judge Washington set down the reports and studied her for a moment. "You know, Miss Bennett, when I sentenced you 6 months ago, many people thought I was being too harsh. Some thought I was being too lenient. But I saw something in you that day, a potential for change that just needed the right opportunity." He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city below. Your father's lawyers have filed numerous appeals, all of which I've denied. Do you know why? Alexandra thought about it, then spoke softly, because the sentence wasn't really a punishment at all. It was a gift. Judge Washington turned, surprise and approval mingling in his expression. The day I almost hit that school bus, Alexandra continued, her voice steady despite her emotions, I wasn't just risking lives with my reckless driving. I was living recklessly, period. Money and privilege had blinded me to what really matters: community, responsibility, human connection. She reached into her simple handbag and pulled out a notebook. I've been keeping a journal of everyone I've met during my service. Rose, who taught me about dignity in aging. Nina, who showed me that strength comes in many forms. The twins, who remind me daily that joy is contagious. These people aren't just names anymore, they're part of my story. Judge Washington returned to his desk and picked up his gavel. Miss Bennett, based on these reports and my own observations, I'm satisfied that you've not only completed your sentence but have exceeded all expectations. Your community service requirement is officially fulfilled. The gavel came down with a gentle tap, so different from the thunderous crack 6 months ago. But Alexandra didn't move to leave. Your Honor, she said, straightening in her chair, I'd like to request something. Go on. I'd like to continue my service hours voluntarily. All of them: the crossing guard shifts, the bus program, the transit center work. And she took a deep breath, I'd like to use my father's connections to create a foundation supporting public transportation initiatives for underprivileged communities. Judge Washington leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And what does your father think about this? He's adjusting, Alexandra laughed softly. But seeing how this experience has changed me, he's starting to understand. We're actually talking now, really talking, about responsibility, privilege, and giving back. Standing up, Judge Washington extended his hand. Miss Bennett, when you first entered my courtroom, you saw me only as someone beneath you. Now what do you see? Alexandra took his hand firmly. I see a wise man who gave me the chance to become someone better than I was. Someone who showed me that true justice isn't about punishment, it's about transformation. As she left the courthouse that afternoon, Alexandra stopped to help a young mother struggling with a stroller down the steps. The woman thanked her profusely, and Alexandra smiled, remembering how she used to rush past such scenes without a second glance. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was time for her afternoon shift at the transit center. As she waited at the bus stop, she noticed a familiar face: Rose, her very first bus companion. Well, if it isn't my favorite bus buddy, Rose said warmly. Still riding with us common folk? Alexandra sat down beside her, smiling. I'm not riding with common folk, Rose. I'm riding with family. Above them, the afternoon sun painted the city in golden light, touching everyone, rich and poor, young and old, those who drove luxury cars and those who rode buses, with the same warm glow. Alexandra Bennett, once known only for her wealth and attitude, had found something far more valuable than money could buy. A place in the heart of her community.